So what I'd like to do to start off with is talk about Latin in general. Now, it's nothing that I haven't said before, because I didn't prepare a lot of notes or anything, but when it comes to the Latin language, the biggest thing, at least for me, is the fact of unity. As I mentioned before, when you look at the story of Babel, one of the natural observations from that is the fact that we know from our own life that what divides us is language, right? And so it's so appropriate that after Pentecost we have a common language. Now, you're not generally going to meet anyone on the street and have a conversation in Latin with them, right? Although one of my seminary professors did say that he, who's from Argentina, met a Chinese or some Oriental Catholic priest. Neither of them knew any language in common except for Latin. So they had a conversation on the street in Latin. So it may actually happen, but for especially those of us living in such a multicultural country, or part of the country particularly, there's a very pressing practical need as well. There are lots of other reasons, but if nothing else, it's our heritage. And this is where it's funny. The same kind of people who are going to be proud to be Irish, who are going to be proud to be Italian, who are going to be proud to be Mexican, whatever it is, at the same time are going to not put the effort into their native language as a Catholic. And really that just comes down to laziness. There's also in the liturgy a lack of understanding of what real participation is, et cetera, and also the fact that I keep telling people, whenever I show up to a parish, the disadvantage is that this is not something that you should or are meant to be learning in your 60s or 70s. This is something that you should have grown up immersed in, and it should be natural. It shouldn't be this frustrating for anyone, but it is, and so we've got to deal with that frustration. So what I'd like to do today is to go over, in particular, two things. I'd like to talk about pronunciation, and I would like to talk about how the language functions. So you're going to get your handouts in just a second, and there's a number of them. We're going to start with the two prayers. So there's the large print ones. If you pull those out on top, okay? We're going to do the Our Father and the Hail Mary. There's a pronunciation guide or hint we're going to talk about, and then there's some charts as a review. Now, this is, again, not a full course in one evening class, but especially for those of you who may not be as familiar with the language, this should help you a little bit. So, we're going to awkwardly pause here for a second while we get these passed out. Just take them to them. Don't staple, just take them to them. Yeah. The prayers are not on top. That's all, that should all be one. Yeah, we're definitely going to edit this video. Okay. Chris, that should be all one packet. Yeah. So just hand that to someone. All right. So the prayers should be in the back, so pull those out. All right, resume the video. All right, so let's first go through this, because pronunciation, of course, is the most practical side. So I'm going to pray it all through once. Those of you who already know it, please feel free to join me as I say it out loud. We'll do both prayers, and then we'll go back and talk about some of the elements in the prayer. All right, so the Our Father is Pater Noster, qui es in celis, sanctificetur nomen tuum. Adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicut in cielo et in terra. Panem nostrum quotidianum da nobis hodie, et dimitte nobis debita nostra, sicut et nos dimittimus debitoribus nostris, et ne nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo. Amen. the Hail Mary. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus. Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen. All right, so let's go through, and as we go through these prayers, pull out some of the rules of pronunciation, right? Unlike English, which can be extremely difficult, where you have things like the whole through, though, etc., the same spelling is pronounced different ways. You don't have that problem in Latin. There are some rules, but other than that, it's very straightforward. So, Pater Noster, qui es in caeli. So this is the first one, right? C is pronounced differently depending on what follows it. So you see here that C followed by the diphthong AE is pronounced as a CH. Okay? You see in the next line the same thing. So the CE in sanctificetur is also CH, right? You see it again now, but you see in the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 line, sicut, the CU is not pronounced that way. It's pronounced as a K, right? Sicut in, and then we have cielo another time, right? I was about to say otra vez, but that's a different class. Okay. Are there any other C's here in the prayer? There's another sicut, right? There's the same thing there in the next to last line. You have CA. So that is also a hard C, a K.
Are you on the Our Father?
Yes. All right. Well, that takes care of a lot of things right there, the pronunciation of C.
The last one you called it?
Inducas.
Inducas, okay.
Ka. Inducas, right?
So the
Chetur. Right. All right. So CAE or CE is the CH, and then with a U or an A, it's a K. Right. Okay. So that's the first thing that we see in these prayers. All right. Try to see if there's anything in the Hail Mary. We'll get to those in a minute, but there's nothing new, I don't think. All right, so what's the next thing we've got? Here's another rule that's very helpful for pronunciation. Every vowel gets its own syllable, except diphthongs. Don't ask me why they're called diphthongs. I have no idea. Okay, but diphthongs are the AE and the OE. When they're often they're printed together, touching, so that you know they're a diphthong. Okay, so you see there you have the diphthong AE in caelis. And I don't know if there's an yeah. So AE is one of the common ones, and OE is the other one. So when you see that together, so how does that work? So look at, for example, the last word on the third line. Okay? Right, so there are 2 U's, which means there are how many syllables? 2, right? Exactly. So there's other words, and this is where, when I'm teaching this to children, especially when they're learning syllables for the first time, they do the whole clapping thing, right? Yeah, that's great, and it works, okay? So you can take that for any of these words. How about, here's another one, on the very small line right beneath Panem Nostrum, so about halfway down the page, 3-word line there, da nobis, right? And then there's another word there. How many vowels are there?
2, 3.
3. So how many syllables is that? 3. So it's ODA, right? Every vowel gets its own syllable unless it's a diphthong. And while we're on the word ODA, do you notice that I did not pronounce it HODIA, right? So, H's are silent. With, I think, only one exception. All right? So, let's go back up to the 4th line, because there's another one right there. How do you pronounce the second word in the 4th line? Regnum, not regnum. Okay? So the GM is like the Spanish ñ, which is basically an NI. So you basically ignore the G. Okay? So it's regnum. It's the same thing with Agnus Dei, right? It's not Agnus Dei, it's Agnus Dei. So regnum, agnus, that kind of word.
So the G is kind of silent
Only in this case.
because it's pronounced like that.
Yes, when it's combined with the N. There's one more pronunciation thing that I think we can easily do on this for the Our Father, and that is on the middle of the prayer, starting Panem Nostrum, right? The halfway point there. No, that's actually not a good example. Let me try that again. That's very interesting. So the rule that I was about to tell you is TI is pronounced as TSI, but that's not always the case. So I'm trying to find, there is an example. Here we go. Look on the next to last line. It's tentationes. All right? So the TI in this case is pronounced as a TSI. And I think I see, I don't have the rule memorized, but I'm pretty sure if it's preceded by an A. Which we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay? The reason I say that it has to be preceded by something, which I think is an A, notice I'm not an expert on this, is if you look at my previous example, in the middle of the page, the line Panem Nostrum Quotidianum, right? It's a TI, but it's not pronounced TSI. Right? And the same thing on the 4 lines up from the bottom. Sicut et nos dimittimus. It's not dimitsimus, it's dimittimus, right? So it's only in limited circumstances that it's pronounced C.
So can we say when followed by A? I mean,
Preceded by, yeah. You can say that for now. There may be another vowel that it does the same thing, but I don't know it off the top of my head. I was hoping someone might man in the chair it for me. Yes, go ahead, Chris.
It says on Google that if it's standing before a vowel and doesn't end followed by any letter except S, X, or T.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm buying that.
Okay.
Yeah. Because quo is a vowel, so why is it not quotidianum? All right, that's good for that prayer. Let's go next page. We're going to keep coming back to the prayers, of course, because we're going to use the prayers to talk about all the grammar. One of the biggest things, if you ever want to learn anything in a foreign language, is start with things you're familiar with, right? That's why I insist on all the Mexican ladies coming to the daily Mass in English, that they have the little booklet in front of them where they have both languages so they can compare, right? And you all know your prayers. So, let's look at the Hail Mary then, the Ave Maria, Okay? So we see in the first line the rule that we just went over, right? It's not gratia plena, it's gratia plena. And of course you can see this is where the Spanish gets the word gracias, or gracia, because it becomes the C, right? So gratia plena, right? At the end of the first half of the prayer, the most holy name of Jesus. So there are different ways that it's spelled. Sometimes it's spelled with an I, sometimes it's spelled with a J. I have no idea the origins of that or why it is that way, but that's why you see, for example, at the top of the cross, I-N-R-I, because it's Jesus Nazarenus Rex Judeorum, and so it's spelled with an I. And when you put the I and the E together, you get kind of a Y sound anyway, or a J sound anyway, right? Disagree with me, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. All right. The only other thing to repeat here is in the last line you have two of the rules that we've already gone over. Ora, so it's silent, right? The H is silent. And then the nostre, the AE is a diphthong that combines it. Any questions before we move on? Or contributions? All right, so go ahead and leave your prayers kind of out to the side so you can easily get to them, because we're going to refer back to them frequently, because these are the examples I'm going to use. Before we go on to more of the grammar, though, I do want to take a minute and go over the pronunciation hints sheet, which should be very close to the prayer sheet. Okay, now, this is particularly helpful for Spanish to Latin. I don't know that pronunciation is necessarily the best word to use here, but what I have found as I've taught Latin, especially this past year, especially to the children in the school, and especially since they're all Hispanic pretty much, and most of them speak Spanish at least fairly well, is that in trying to help them understand the Latin just intuitively, is I try to connect it to words they already know. Now, you're thinking, Father, we're not Hispanic children, why are you telling us this? Well, because if you are educated, and y'all are educated, and many generations have been educated, the current ones aren't necessarily, but we are. If you know your English at any depth, then a lot of your, what we used to call SAT words, right, are from Latin. And so this actually does help. It's helped me in my Spanish, and it helps me in my Latin as well, because my English vocabulary is such, I'm not bragging, I've been given the education, thank God, but it's such that I can actually intuit a lot more of it because of my English. Just as a side note, what I mean is things like, I was introducing a friend of mine to Star Wars. We were in seminary, and as the text is scrolling at the beginning, he looks at me and says, "Now I know why you talk the way you do," right? Not that it was necessarily the highest English, but that kind of language. Especially you watch older movies and you see that the vocabulary is so much better than in modern movies. But on this sheet here, there are some phonetic hints that help you make the connections. Again, it won't be as helpful to you in English, but it can be helpful. So I'll give you an example. One of the words that sticks out in my mind that we went over this year, that the children were able to connect with on, is manus in Latin, right? Well, it's mano in Spanish. It's just a matter of changing the ending, right? But manual, right? So that word that in English comes from the same thing. So this can help. So just look at this real quick. This is, in fact, some of the rules we've already gone over are on this, right? But phonetically, remember that vowels can be very interchangeable. What you really need to focus on is that there is a vowel, even if you don't know what it is, and what are the consonants around it, right? That's what's most important if you're trying to make the connection as you're reading. Another thing you need to keep in mind is that some of these consonants are very interchangeable. B and P. I always love telling the story. When you go to an Arab country, the drink is called Bebsi because Arabic does not have a P. Now, Farsi does in Persia, so they have Pepsi. But Arabs have Bebsi because because they don't have a P. But they do that because that's the closest phonetic sound to it. And you see that in between words. M and N, between Spanish and Portuguese, there's a big difference. The Portuguese use M a lot more than the Spaniards do. D and T is also very important. Again, another example that you'll know in Spanish, right? You know what the word padre means, right? Father. Well, pater is the word in Latin. So if you interchange the D and the T and just reverse the order of the last two letters, you have the Spanish word, right? So there's a lot of that goes on. V and B are also very interchangeable. Again, for Spanish speakers, you actually pronounce the V as a B. And then, if you don't know how to spell, you text people using B instead of E, which is very frustrating, but it happens, right? P and B, so all these are very much related. The Y and the I are also related. The word, the name for the letter Y in Spanish is Y, which never clicked for me until I was already ordained. Y means Spanish I, right? So it's pronounced, or it's used as that vowel. And you know that, especially, did I say Spanish I? I meant Greek I. Need to fix that, because if you have a word with a Y in the middle of it, not like an LY at the end, but a Y in the middle of it, then it's almost guaranteed to be Greek. It's a Greek I, Y, right? So symbol, mystery, all these words are Greek words because there's a Greek I in the middle of it, okay? So that's something that you need to know. And again, the I and the J, as well as I mentioned earlier, for spelling purposes is the same. And the rest of these, we've already gone over, the H being silent, the TI being TSI in certain cases, and then how the C is pronounced as a CH with certain vowels. So, all right, pause there for a second. Any questions on pronunciation? I'm not expecting you to have this memorized or anything, but I'm hoping it's helping out at least a little bit. Anything you want me to clarify before we move on? Okay, I'm glad I'm such a good teacher. You don't need me to clarify anything. All right. Yes. My teaching Latin ability is exceeded only by my humility. So, let's talk about the nature of Latin as a language. Latin is what we call an inflected language, okay? So inflected means it gets broken down a lot. So if any of you studied German, okay. Do any of you, actually, any of you study Spanish? Okay. Any other, pretty much any foreign language other than English is more inflected. We just lose it all. So inflection meaning that you're going to have a lot of ending changes, etc., which communicate person, number, even tense, etc., right? So the inflection of the language, I know German is still highly inflected, right? The nouns are what we call declined, and verbs are conjugated. And I think it was Mark Twain said something to the effect of, I'd rather decline 2 beers than a German noun. As it turned down the beer, but anyway, it was fine. And German beer is so good that you know that must have been really rough for him to turn down the beers. So what we have here is, you can just look at these, and hopefully you still have them in sequence. If not, it's not a big deal. So the one chart I gave you, the first one should be the nouns and pronouns. So I'm not giving you all my charts because I have like 20 pages of them, but just so that as we go through this, you have an idea. These are more of the common ones anyway. So this is nouns. Nouns are grouped by declension, which just simply means it's a category or a family of nouns, right? So the endings change per declension. And you'll notice that there are different genders within the declensions. There may only be 2 sexes, but there are many genders, and there's a lot of the way this is broken down, right? You also see that they are, so that's what we mean by number, right? So let's talk about that real quick. So, nouns are categorized by gender, by number and by case. So let's talk about these real quick. Okay, so gender, okay? What are the 3 grammatical genders? All together? Masculine, feminine, and neuter. Okay? So, there's some errors in the formatting, but nouns are either masculine, feminine, or neuter. Doesn't always make sense what they assign them sometimes, but especially for the objects, but you know what? That's okay. So, they are either masculine, feminine, or neuter. There are 2 options for the number. And when I say number, I don't mean numeral. It means how many, right? And when we're talking about grammar, there's only 2 options. They are singular and plural, right? Okay? So, a noun is masculine, feminine, neuter, singular, plural, and then you have cases. Now, case, I'm not going to give all the examples. They're already listed on your page. But the case is how the noun is used, or how the noun is being used in the sentence. And that we're going to take a minute and go over that ourselves. All right. So, but look at the chart real quick, just so you can see how it's broken down. So, you have to figure out what declension you're in before you can figure out which chart to use. The way that you figure out what declension you're in is usually when you look it up in a dictionary, the genitive singular is your key. You see that genitive is G-E-N. We'll talk about what genitive means in a minute, right? And then the singular is the first column, right? So that ending there tells you which declension you're in. So when you look up a noun in the dictionary, and it's always listed by 2 words. It's listed by the nominative singular and the genitive singular. So you look at the genitive singular and you say, okay, the genitive singular ending is AE. You go to your chart, okay, that's a first declension noun. Move over real quick to the second declension. It's the same thing. If the ending is US in the nominative and I in the genitive, or UM in the nominative and I in the genitive, then that is a second declension noun. Again, I'm not expecting you to look this up or memorize what I just said, but I'm just telling you that's how they're identified by declension. So once you figure out what declension you're in, that's how then you determine what case the noun needs to be in, and that's the ending it's supposed to have. Now,
Can you define declension for me?
it's just family.
Okay.
It's just kind of like, it's a grammatical family for nouns,
Okay.
right? There may be a better definition, but I think that will suffice. Now, let's take a minute just so you understand what we mean by case. We're not going to go through a lot of detail, but the next 2 charts you should have should say quick reference at the top.
Yes.
2 charts, yes. Right? So you have case, type, function, and key identifiers at the top of that. You see that? Looks like this.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So the cases are over there on the left. Now, let's give a simple example here, though, before we get into the complicated, right? So, I threw the ball to him, and all of these markers are dying, so those need to go in. So, we all know from our grammar that I is the subject, right? Throw is a verb, not worried about that. The is an article. The ball to him. Now, these are then objects, right?
Right.
So which one is the direct object and which one is the indirect object?
Direct
Ball
object
is
be
direct.
Ball is the direct object, and him is the indirect object. Now you would think, because you're throwing the ball to him, that he's the direct object, but the object is the object of the verb, and the thing that is actually being thrown is the direct object, right?
The ball.
So, these are what I mean by case, is how the noun is being used in the sentence. In English, we don't have the same breakdown, right? Yes, you have I and me, right? Although A lot of people don't understand that difference anymore either, right?
Right.
I and me, the difference between I and me is a difference of case. The difference between he and him is also a difference of case, right? So if him was being used as the subject, it would be he, right? Latin has a lot more, okay? So if you look at the two charts, you have nominative, genitive, accusative, dative, ablative, right? They're on the side with Roman
Yeah,
numerals.
I see it now.
All right? So, and again, we're not going to do it in a lot of detail tonight, but you see that the nominative case can be used as, and that's under the type column there, it can be used as the subject, which is what we would normally use it for. It could also be used as a predicate nominative, and as we know, that's the subject being, so a noun in the predicate being used to describe the subject, right? Father is a teacher. Teacher is a noun describing me. That's a predicate nominative. I'm the subject and the predicate nominative, and I'm being referred to, right? It's also being used, it can also be used as a predicate adjective, which is the same thing except it's an adjective describing the subject, right? Now, we don't have the genitive case strictly. We do possession in a different way, right? But you can see here in Latin, the first use of the genitive is the possessive. Here's a very good example. The nominative for God is Deus. The genitive for God is Dei. So that's why Lamb of God is Agnus Dei, because it's in the genitive, because God, it's the lamb belongs to God. Make sense? Now, there are other uses, and they're very interesting, and we generally do not use all of these different uses. But the point of this being is that for all of these uses, sometimes they have prepositions, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes it's just the word, right? So, for example, if you go to just finding a good example here that's very... Okay, so if you look under the accusative, it's the third one down, right? The third case. Letter D, of place, to, or into which. We would say, I'm going to the store, right? In Latin, you would say, I'm going store. And the ending of the word store would tell you that I'm going to a place. Right? So we simply use prepositions for many of the things that cases do. But I mean, even when you have prepositions, and we'll go back and look at the prayers in a minute to describe this, to understand the case usage. But even when you have prepositions, you have to have the right ending. A good example of that, and you'll see that in the prayers in the Our Father, is that the word in can be used for several different things in Latin. And if it has an accusative ending, it means one thing. If it has a dative ending, it means something else. Okay? So, the good thing is that you are generally translating from Latin into English. There's none of you are being required ever to translate something from English into Latin. And it's always easier to translate into your own language because then your mind fills in the gaps. Because if you read in Latin, he is going store, your brain would fill in the two already, right? So you have it easy. It's because you're not doing any of the translation. Not that I'm going from English to Latin really either. I will say though, one of my students, one of my brightest students, we got to the point where he was actually able to put together a couple of simple sentences. And he wrote the sentence, Pater vetus est, which is, father is old. Now he was referring to his own father, but I'm also pater, right? So I laughed, and I was very proud of him for taking the initiative. And then I wrote discipulus mortuus est, which means the student is dead. So, but again, you're mostly translating from Latin into English, so you can just understand what's going on in the Mass and such. So it's also helpful for plaques and things like that, you know, especially if you see pictures of churches in Rome or whatever, you can have an idea of what's going on. So let's just keep going again just to have an idea. So I just gave you an example of the accusative, which would be very common, right? If you were actually translating, you would often use a reference to place, right? The vocative is very interesting. It's direct address, which is helpful when you're dealing with people, but there's a vocative for every noun. So you can address the chair if you really wanted to in Latin. There's a form for it, okay? You also have the locative, which is only used for nouns of the first and second declension. Locative means location as well, right? The next page is very helpful because these are the most common ones. So the dative and the ablative are used for a lot of things. And again, I'm just going to point out a few of them so you get an idea of what we're talking about. So the dative is the indirect object, right? So that's, we just talked about the indirect object here with throwing the ball. But you also have under our B there is a dative of the possessor. So genitive is not the only case that shows possession. There is, letter E is also really common. Personal agency, okay? Showing who is doing something, okay? And then certain verbs just simply take the dative. The ablative is kind of like the catch-all case. If it doesn't fall into anything else, you use the ablative. So there's, again, a number of different ones. Letter C is very common. So the ablative of means, all right, by which an action is taken, right? So he wrote with a pen. Pen would be in the ablative in this case, right? You also have J, ablative of place where, okay? There's a comparison, etc., etc. So there is a number of uses for the ablative. Again, not having to memorize this, but just to understand that the case endings communicate a lot of grammatical points. So let's take a minute and let's look at our prayers again and see if we can't find some examples of this. And again, there's a very good example of this in the Our Father. So let's look at the Pater Noster real quick. In the second line of the Pater Noster, look at the last two words. In celis, right? Now, go down 4 lines to sicut in cielo. Now, what happened? It's both in, right?
Yes.
So why is the ending different? Because as I said earlier, in means 2 different things depending on what case is being used. So let me just flip to my handy little vocabulary sheet and look up prepositions and see that the preposition in, when used with the accusative, means into, onto, against, or for the purpose of. But if in has the ablative, it's in or on, among, by means of, or with. Okay?
So the one he's in heaven and the one that will be done as in heaven.
As in heaven, right?
Is that the difference? That's a question, not a statement.
Sorry?
That's just a question, not a
That's, I
statement.
mean, that's, I don't know.
One, he is in heaven, and
Right.
the other, his will be done in heaven.
Well, right, so it's, I think as is what changes, right?
Okay.
So it's, his will is being done in heaven, is almost like among heaven, right? I'll look up something here real quick to make the point. Right, so that would be a third declension. So, well, actually it may not be, I don't remember. Oh wait, I have it in my sheet as well. So, I don't know why I'm not finding this. Yeah, I'm just going to leave that for the sake of time, but you get the idea, right? That it's depending on how it's being used, all right? So let's look at, I think there's at least one other good example. There's a couple of good examples here, right? Actually, go to the Hail Mary. Go to the Ave Maria. Trying to find a good example here. Well, okay, yeah, let's do this. Go back to the Pater Noster, all right? So again, the endings tell you the gender, or they tell you the number of the case, right? So one of the things you know is that of agreement between pronouns and nouns, and of course between adjectives and nouns. So look at, for example, the 4th and 5th lines, right? You have the same pronoun being used in both lines, at the end of the line, right? One of them is tuum, and one of them is tua, because regnum is neuter, but voluntas is feminine. And so the ending matches the gender there, right? There's another couple of examples you see.
What was regnum again?
Regnum is neuter,
Neuter.
right? You also see these changes in the pronouns. I'll just touch on that a minute while I'm here. If you look at the after panem nostrum, so about halfway down, you have da nobis odie et dimite nobis debita nostra, sicut et nos dimitimus debitoribus nostris. You have the same pronoun for us, for we, the first person plural, in how many forms? You have nostrum, you have nobis, you have nostra, nos, and nostris.
Yeah.
Those are all forms of the first person plural, but it changes depending on the number in the case, right? And if you want to see those, some of the examples of pronouns are on that first chart, the horizontal one with the nouns, right? So you see that they manifest differently depending on how they're being used by gender or case, gender, number, or case.
What about debita and debitoribus?
Well, so the tor makes it a person, right? A debtor is a person. The debt is what they have, the debtor is the person, right? And my mind is going blank on another example in English, but other than debtor. But we have some words that end in tor because they are the person that's doing, right? So. Okay, I think that's all I'm going to say right now on nouns, unless there are any particular questions on nouns. Because I do want to take a few more minutes without going too late this evening on verbs, all right? So go ahead, you have 2 charts for verbs, right? One is basic Latin grammar, verbs, active, voice, indicative, mood, and then the other one is irregular verbs. Let's look at those for a minute. Unlike Fulton Sheen, I do not have an angel erasing my board. Now, verbs are even more complicated if you understand grammar. Now, for most of us, we who grew up in our native language don't have a problem with this because we're just used to it. So, what is it that, how are they broken down? Now, first of all you need to know about conjugations is it's like declensions. It's just families, right, that follow the same rules. So you have all of the conjugations listed across the top there, right? First, second, third, and fourth, because naturally there had to be a difference, right, between the 2 thirds, right? So we know that verbs, just looking at this chart here, what do we have? We have, first of all, how do we break down verbs? You have person, you have number, you also have voice, mood, and I think I'm missing one and I can't remember what it is. Tense, thank you, that's really important. Okay. Okay, now, person, what are the persons? Now, those are examples of the pronouns, but what are the persons?
First, second, third.
First, second, and third. All right? Number is the same as the nouns, right? Singular and plural. So, first person is the person speaking. Second person is the person being spoken to. Third person is the person being spoken about. Okay? I have to do this exercise with the children and say, point to first person. You know, point to second person. Point to third person. And they eventually get it down. So, but we need to know first, second, and third person, right? You know it as for example, writing styles, writing in the first person, writing in the second person, etc., or the third person. For video games, you have video games that are in the first person, right? That kind of thing. So person is important. Number, again, is very simple, singular, plural. Voice is active or passive. Now again, English is not inflected. So we simply do things like, the ball was thrown by him, right? So that's the passive voice. Or the ball was thrown, I should say, it would be the verb of the passive voice, right? And then we sometimes add the who did it, but for agency. But in reality, the verb would be in the passive voice.
What's the active voice? The same.
Threw. So he threw is active. Was thrown, the ball was thrown is passive. Okay? This is fun. That was sarcasm. Indicative, subjunctive. Which ones am I missing? Or are these the only ones? Either way, subjunctive is the simplest example I can give for the subjunctive is, for example, conditional clauses. Again, not a problem in English. It's not inflected. If you do this, that will happen, right? We don't change the verb for it. But in Latin, you would change the verb. Yes?
Imperative.
Oh, imperative. Thank you. Keep it up. That was imperative. Okay. Just in case you missed the subtlety there. Okay. So, thank you. It's okay. When you give a command, that's being imperative, right? So keep it up. Okay. Tense we know, right? Now again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but very simply, the simple tenses are past, present, and future, right? Now, you see on this chart, the tenses are in black there, right? So you have present, imperfect, future, perfect, pluperfect, and future perfect.
Those are all tenses.
Yes.
In Latin.
Yes. Well, I mean, and we have the tenses as well. If you look below, and I know it's small print, so if you didn't bring your magnifier, I apologize. But if you look before it, the present is obviously the verb, or am, are plus the verb, right? But the imperfect is was, were, or used to, as opposed to the future, which is will, whatever. The perfect, which is have, plus the verb, had plus the verb, or will have in the future perfect,
Yeah, we
right?
have those.
Yeah, we have them. We just don't, the Latin doesn't have all those extra words. They just change the ending. Now, having them and being able to label them is a whole other story.
Yeah.
You know, or being able to identify it. If I had asked you when you walked in, what tense is it when you say, I will have finished this class by 8:30, you would have looked at me like, yeah. So, well, maybe not. Someone might have known it, but I wouldn't have known it. That's why I have charts, right? So this is how verbs are broken down. And again, in Latin, the ending communicates most of this.
So instead of saying will have, it just changes the ending that means
Yes.
that.
So you look at the bottom there. So we'll use I pray as an example, right? So when I say I pray or I am praying, it's ego oro. So this is the top left of each of the boxes, right? If I'm going to say I was praying, or I used to pray, or I was praying, it would be oraba, ego oraba. If I say I will pray, it's orado. If I want to say I have prayed, it's ego oravi. If I say I had prayed, it would be ego oraveram. And if I want to say I will have prayed, it's ego oravero. Now, there are patterns to this, right? Once you know them, it's easier to memorize. And again, this is not something you do every day. You barely do it if you go to daily mass, right? And you're not really translating. You're just, but if you are more immersed in this, it would be more natural. Again, taking this class at your age is not natural. This is not how you should be learning languages. So it's difficult and it's completely understandable, right? So again, the endings change a little bit per conjugation, but not a lot, right? So very often, and again, and Spanish comes from this, so if you know your Spanish, it makes it a lot easier, but the S is often indicative of the second person singular. The M vowel S is often indicative of the first person plural, right? We. And the NT, as you can see, is indicative of the third person plural, right? So there are patterns and commonalities that even if you don't get the exact grammar, you at least get the nuance or the idea of what we're talking about, right? So there are patterns to this. Now, there are verbs which are irregular. Let's look at the next page. And really the only one that I want to look at is the top line, because this is going to be the most common, except for some passages in Scripture which are in the past tense, and sometimes in the future. The first line, this is the verb to be, right? Sum. Sum esse fui futurus. To be in Latin. So the present, indicative, active voice is sum is I am, es is you are, est is he, she, it is, sumus is we are, estis is y'all are, and sunt is they are. Yeah, poor Yankees, they don't have second person plural. Okay. Every other language in the world I know of has a second person plural, but we decided we were better. Okay, so sum es, sumus esti, sunt. And if you look at the top of the page, you see tense, voice, mood, and then one SG obviously is first person singular, second person singular, third person singular, and then first, second, and third person plural. Okay? I find it ironic that the most used verb in language has to be irregular. But you have to know it. And the good thing is, though, is that when you have a lot of it, you or because of it being so common, you pick up on it pretty quickly, right? So, what I'd like you to do is to take a minute. We're going to pause here. I'm not in a rush, but I've covered basically the content I wanted to cover this evening. What I'd like to do is give